Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to an album ranking for my favorite band. Yes, we are talking about Pink Floyd. Band formed way back in 1965 and has released 15 studio albums, sold over 250 million albums around the world. The band also has the album that holds the most weeks on the Billboard 200 album chart at over 962 weeks. Second album's not even close to that. Not many bands have racked up as many accolades as Pink Floyd. Certainly stood the test of time through multiple genres, multiple eras. Join me now as I count down all 15 of their studio albums by Pink Floyd. All right, before we get into that though, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you're gonna stay up to date on really cool videos just like this here with a Pink Floyd album ranking. So as I mentioned at the top of this, they are my favorite band, but that in no way should sway your opinion of this video here. I do try to break it all down, give you guys a little bit of info on it, and at the same time stay true to how I feel about the album versus what maybe media and pop culture tells you that you should feel about an album. All right, with that in mind, coming in at number 15, Umaga from 1969. This was their fourth studio album at the time. It's a double album split in two, with LP number one being the live side and LP number two doing solo material from each member. It's an interesting concept and idea to an album. And actually, interestingly, at the time, the album was, sort of critically acclaimed. But since that time, it has drawn negative opinions and even criticism from the band. I think that has in part to do with the fact of the band still trying to find its foothold, where they fit into everything and musically where they wanted to go. For me, the parts of the solo material that are on this album are just a little too maybe experimental or conceptual for what makes a good album, repeated listens and that sort of thing. Of course, I'm referring to the Roger Waters song that is on here, and I'll see if I can get this right. Several species of a small furry animals gathered together in a cave, grooving with a pict. Long-ass title. That's about the most interesting aspect of the song, in my opinion. I understand the idea, and I think at the time, as a piece of art, it may have worked, but in terms musically and longevity of the album, for me, that just doesn't work. And it's song number 6 on the album. It really breaks the flow, something I think is key to making a great album. So the only saving grace, really, in my opinion, is the live stuff that's on here, which is amazing. But since we're talking about ranking the studio albums, this one is coming in last place for that reason. Okay, coming in at number 14, More from 1969, third studio album. First without the band's founder, Syd Barrett. Soundtrack to a movie of the same name. The band had already explored film work before this, doing a couple different tracks. There was a song, Tomorrow's World, and The Committee. And early on, the band, as I said, was still trying to find themselves, especially after losing Syd Barrett, as he stepped away from everything. And so the exploration into soundtrack music was one of the directions they were going. And I think it certainly added a more atmospheric vibe, or lent itself to a more atmospheric vibe than the previous more just straight up psychedelic sounds that they had been doing. And so I think that that is something that these early albums need to be recognized for. But it didn't necessarily help to provide a cohesiveness throughout the album. There's some really great tracks on here. I like the opening track, Cirrus Minor, that's on here, but there's examples that I think are less successful, like track number 2, the Nile Song, where that one there has what I would call an early punk vibe to it. And again, the soundtracks allowed the band to explore many different genres of music as they tried to really figure out where they wanted to go. Some of the tracks on here come off as musical cues, meaning they don't really feel like a song in and of itself. So again, it has that soundtrack vibe, taking it away from what I consider really a musical album. There's and one of the ones that I was referencing in terms of that more musical cue thing was Up the Khyber, just as a case. Good track, just not like a song. And so those sort of reasons are why this album is coming in at number 14. Okay, number 13, Adam Hart Mother from 1970, fifth studio album. Incidentally, we just got a deluxe edition reissue of this. I have done a full review of that if you're interested. I'll leave the link in the description for that. Personally, I've never liked this album cover on here, although there's a conceptual idea behind it. At the time, it was a direct response to a lot of space rock imagery being used with the band. And so they had the album artist Hypnosis, who had worked with Zeppelin, Rainbow, UFO, and of course doing lots of Pink Floyd covers, come up with this. And since they wanted to explore a lot of different styles of music, they wanted to really get away from that idea of simply space rock. So a cow standing in a grass field was chosen as the album art. But for me, album art is a big thing. And when the album art is lesser than the music, sometimes to me that can take away from the greatness that an album can be. The album sound, though, on here, while perhaps one of the first to present what I think is the sounds that would become known for what Pink Floyd is, especially the opening suite that is on here, Adam Hart Mother. Still, like Umaga, the first side focuses on the band together. The second side has the individual members on it, creating a very disparate two sides to the album. The thing is, though, there's still a lot of quality on this album. I think it's worth exploring for what it is. But again, just not a very cohesive, solid album all the way through. Number 12, we have Piper at the Gates of Dawn, 1967, their debut studio album. Only one to feature Syd Barrett on the whole of the album. This one here, for what it is, as a psychedelic album from the 60s, I think it's a really great album. Now, this is what I'm talking about, where multiple eras, multiple genres of the band, and yet they peaked in all of those or surpassed common levels with all the other bands and everything that was going on at the time. This was a standout album to that psychedelic era, much the same way later albums by Floyd stand out for the prog rock and other stuff. This one here, while I'm not as much a fan of this era here, I do think this is a great album. I like the later era stuff where David Gilmour came into it more. So without Gilmour's involvement on this particular album until the next one, I don't really find myself being drawn to this one as much. I think David Gilmour's guitar playing was a defining element to the band, and with that not being here, making this album less interesting for me. Certainly if I had grown up with this album originally, I might feel different, but I do think, as I said, it is a great album for what it is in the psychedelic movement. And there are some glimpses of brilliance on this, so I don't want to dismiss this album. Things that would be fleshed out to greater effect on later albums. Case in point, the classic opening track, Astronomy Domain, that is on here, I think is a stellar track, and of course what would help define the elements of Floyd later on. Next one coming in at number 11, Obscured by Clouds, 1972, seventh studio album and second album that's recorded for a film. It was a French film called La Vallée. And ultimately, the band, had a falling out with the director and chose not to name it after the film, calling it instead Obscured by Clouds. Whereas their previous foray into film music was more experimental, this one here is where the band really sort of began to hone in on their sound that would become much more defined on the follow-up album after this. And this album here is often seen as a stopgap release because the band was already working on the follow-up Dark Side of the Moon that would come out in 1973 and stopped that, took a break to go record this, put this out, then come back and complete Dark Side of the Moon. Maybe that is why Dark Side of the Moon became so great, because they had a chance to step away, do something else artistic, and return to that. We'll touch on that a bit more when we get to that album. But I think that this is a nice little sidebar piece from the band, you know, and it's what could have been. It's where the band could have gone if they returned and didn't complete Dark Side of the Moon. Really kind of shows you what the band, you know, could have been doing. But I like this album a lot. I think there's a lot of standout things on this album, especially the two opening tracks. And I've always really liked the song Childhood's End. In particular, the remix of this that was done in 2016 for the early years, I think actually makes the album even better than its original release. Coming in at number 10, we've got Metal, 1971, sixth studio album. I've always really liked this particular artwork that's on here, the little drops in the water and appearances like that, which also supposed to have given the effect of the eardrum as part of the art that is on this. So simply based on that opening title track that is on here, I think this could have been one of the band's best albums. That instrumental track that's on here is just a classic Pink Floyd style song and template to what they would be doing so much later on. It's kind of interesting, these early albums that each had maybe one really big standout track that would later define them doing multiples of that sort of stuff on albums going forward. Sort of when the band began to strip away that more experimental side and focus more on maybe a cohesion or just, you know, radio-friendly style songs, however you want to think about it. But I think once the band got to that point, obviously we know that they really excelled at it. This being just, you know, one of the earlier albums on here. But, you know, like, you know, the other albums that, you know, around this time, this one sort of follows suit in that the album was split in two sides. And as I said, you know, I like the conceptual idea of that. And again, maybe when these came out and listening to them on vinyl to actually have that split, I came into these with the CD era, listening to these as one continuous piece of music. And that does change things. Again, there'll be something we'll talk about more on another album, why that's an important way to look at these. Side A on here, I think, is, you know, powerful. It's cohesive. It's rewarding. That is that opening title track that's on here. Whereas side B just works less well. You know, unfortunately, there's the more experimental and or maybe call it conceptual song like Seamus that's on here about a dog they were looking after. And then it's a very bluesy song, so definitely different and away from other stuff that they were doing. But also what's really annoying is they had the dog howling and singing on the track. Conceptually, I get it, I understand, but it's very annoying and it makes me not want to listen to it and skip it. And any album where I have to skip a song on it just hurts for me personally, but also just hurts the flow of the album. That said, the album is bookended by one of their greatest songs, the song's, you know, Echoes, and it just is a stellar track. And so when you have the opening song, One of These Days, the closing song, Echoes, that's on here, it just elevates this album. But as I said, it could have been ranking much higher had it not had that song, Seamus, on here. Okay, coming in at number 9, we've got A Saucer Full of Secrets, 1968. Second studio album. This would be the last one with any contributions from original founding member Syd Barrett, but it was also the first to feature new member David Gilmour in here. For a brief time, the band was a 5-piece that just didn't last very long. And so while still rooted heavily in the 60s psychedelic era sounding stuff, this one works far more for me than their debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I think this one here has more of the characteristics that would define the Pink Floyd sound, probably due in part to David Gilmour coming in on this one and the reduction that they relied on Syd Barrett's input for it. Of the earlier albums, though, I've always drawn more to this one than I have the first one. There's just something that is really good about it for what it is. From album opener that is on here, Let There Be More Light, which is certainly, a great track. But then there's the centerpiece of this album, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is a phenomenal song. And again, when listening to these centerpiece songs from these albums, the idea and direction of where the band would go was not yet known, but to see it develop over time like that must have been something really amazing. I think, had the band continued in this style for the next few albums, it would have been really interesting to see what would have happened, although that's where they got off on the more experimental territory. Next up, we've got coming in at number 8, the Final Cut from 1983. 12th studio album from the band, last to feature Roger Waters, and essentially a Roger Waters solo album. It's mostly written by him, led by him, and he only kind of sporadically used the other members of the group for this album. At this point, we already have missing elements from Rick Wright, who was no longer part of the group, who had been dismissed back, I think, just prior to The Wall. And I've always thought that Rick Wright is an unsung hero of Pink Floyd. His keyboard sound has so much to do with the atmospheric feel of these albums, and without it, you clearly hear something missing. And to that degree with this, the minimal use of David Gilmour's guitar work on this one as well, for me, is what makes it not sound like a full-fledged Pink Floyd album and really just like a solo Roger Waters album. If you listen to Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, you can see the similarities between these two. The thing is, still a good album on here. I just, as a whole, don't find it overly as interesting as the other stuff that they did during their heyday on here, making it an album that I don't return to all that often, and why at least it is placing where it does in my countdown. Coming in at number 7, the last and final album, the 15th studio album, Endless River from 2014. This was the third one without Roger Waters on it. And as I said, this is the last one to date, because you really never know with Pink Floyd. I mean, that album there had been 20 years since the previous album, Division Bell, which it does tie into. The music on Endless River was intended to be the second album of a double album that was part of Division Bell, where they would have the album that had the more song-oriented stuff and then do a more ambient album as the second disc. And that's what all of the material was that they had. They began compiling stuff for a Division Bell reissue, and whether it was the band or the label who said, this material that you dug up archivally is way too good to be released as bonus material, something should be done to it, and that ultimately became the Endless River. The material that is on here is entirely instrumental, except for the final track on the album, Louder Than Words. That's the only one to have vocals and lyrics as part of it. Not really sure why they chose to go down that road, other than maybe they wanted to sort of only minimally spend an amount of time fleshing this out, or maybe they just decided to stay in a more experimental state, releasing it as it was intended, which was that ambient soundscape style, as opposed to turning each one into a song itself. For me, though, I love this album as much as Division Bell. This one is amazing. There are some really great parts on it. I think this album deserves a lot more attention than it gets. Just also very befitting for me of a final album for the band. If this is the one the band chooses to go out on, I am okay with that. Coming in at number 6, we've got A Momentary Lapse of Reason from 1987, 13th studio album, first one without Roger Waters. Only featuring David Gilmour and Nick Mason on it. Rick Wright had not yet returned to the group due to legal reasons, so he was not part of the recording sessions, although he would join up in time to tour with the band. The album itself started as a David Gilmour solo album, later on changed to a Pink Floyd album, and so much like the Final Cut, that predominantly was a Waters solo album. This one here is kind of the same way. It's really predominantly a David Gilmour solo album. I think the difference is, though, that with this one here, this sounded like a Pink Floyd album. That, I think, also ties into the fact of David's guitar playing on it. He has a very defining element of what makes the Pink Floyd sound. And so simply by having that lead guitar work all over the album, this one for me feels much more like a Floyd album than the Final Cut did. Some of my favorite Floyd tracks are on this one, Learning to Fly and On the Turning Away, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs they ever wrote. Of the two versions of this album released, there's an original from 1987, then there's the remix from 2019 where they actually intended to make it much more like a Pink Floyd album, having Nick Mason go in and record drums throughout on it, do the more acoustic drum as opposed to the 1980s electronic drums. They added the live keyboard performances from Rick Wright onto the album so that his keyboards would be there instead of Phil Manzanera and anyone else who might have played at that time on it. So an interesting concept, but it actually took away the power. So I think the superior version is still the 1987 one. That is the one that I'm ranking here. Coming in at number 5, we've got Division Bell from 1984, their 14th studio album. Second one without Roger Waters on it, and first to feature returning keyboardist Rick Wright. Also the last one for him to record while he was alive. So, you know, while my first Pink Floyd album was actually Dark Side of the Moon, I purchased it 2 years earlier for a 20th anniversary edition release when it came out. This was the first new album that I picked up by the band released while, you know, since I had become a fan. And I still remember the announcement of the album. It was just a huge event. Radio stations promoted the announcement. It was broadcast live. They painted up a airship to look like a fish and flew it around London. There was just so much hoopla and stuff that was going on around the big announcement of the album, and then the live stadium tour. That was my first stadium show that I saw, from third row no less. So I've got a lot of great memories tied up around this album, which, so as some of you might be questioning my placement of this right now, the album does hold a special place in my heart, which is one of the reasons it's ranking high, but not just for that, because I think from start to finish on this album, every track is amazing on here. My favorite song on the album, Take It Back, immediately stood out to me when I got it. But I also really like that this album here has Rick Wright returning to lead vocals on it. First time since 1973. He sings on the song Wearing the Inside Out, which is just another amazing track on this album. Coming in at number 4, The Wall. 1979 release, 11th studio album. It was a double album and concept album for them. And this one here, while other albums had had themes throughout them, this one was a true concept. It told a story. It's essentially a rock opera on it. And in my opinion, sort of the one and only that is actually a concept album. The other ones are just themed albums, but I know we could debate that all day. This one was led by bassist Roger Waters. It was his story. He used the input of the other members here and there, but this is the album where it really kind of began to diminish on. No one can deny the classicness of this album. So many amazing standout tracks are on this. Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Mother, Goodbye Blue Sky, Hey You, Comfortably Numb, all just absolutely amazing. Those songs are burned into my brain. But I do think that this album in and of itself is way overplayed, maybe due to the movie, maybe due to its nostalgia, who knows. I also think in a way the album is a bit overhyped. Not saying it isn't great, not saying it isn't phenomenal, but it is a bit overhyped. Due to the nature of the double album, I think there's a bit of filler on here. It would rank a lot higher without that. Had this been a single album, could have been their greatest all-time album for you. Some of you, it might be just that, but for me, it is coming in at number 4. All right, coming in at number 3. This one may be a shocker to some of you guys, but Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, their 8th studio album. This one is the one that has spent the longest time on the Billboard 200 album chart at 962 plus weeks. It's always adding a week here or there, it seems to be. It's sold over 15 million copies in the US, 45 million copies around the world. This is one of the albums that has helped lead the band to over 250 million in album sales worldwide. This one's got such career-defining tracks on it as Money, Time, Us and Them, Great Gig in the Sky. The whole album from start to finish is one of those ones where I think I've heard every track on the radio at some point in time. It is just an utter classic album. And despite it not really being a concept album, again, it's a themed album. It's one of those ones that just every track on it is a standout. But much like The Wall, again, is this album overhyped? I do think it is overplayed. I question that. This one doesn't really have any filler on it, in my opinion. I think all the stuff on here is amazing, but I do think there are better albums in their catalog, which is why this one is coming in at number 3. And now we're going to get to 2 of those that I think are better. Coming in at number 2, Wish You Were Here from 1975, their 9th studio album. This one here only featuring 5 tracks on it, bookended by the 9-part Shine On You Crazy Diamond song, which was a tribute to their founder, Syd Barrett. Despite the album really only having 4 songs that are on this one, each one feels very unique and stands apart from the others on here. It provides definitive elements that make up Pink Floyd's sound on every one of the tracks that's here. Shine On You Crazy Diamond has that progressive element. Welcome to the Machine has the more experimental side. Have a Cigar has that straight up hard rock vibe that we like. Wish You Were Here, pushes the pop or more folk element to the group, but every one of those stands out and is very strong. Very cohesive all the way through, despite the album having those different styles on each of the tracks that are here. And every one of these having also been played on the radio, but somehow they don't feel worn out to me the way that some of the tracks do from those bigger albums like The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon, which is why, for me at least, this album is coming in at number 2. All right, and the number 1 album for Pink Floyd out of all 15 of theirs, for me at least, Animals, 1977 release, 10th studio album. This one here, another one of those themed albums, loosely based on George Orwell's political fable Animal Farm, and focuses on the socio-political conditions of the day at the time. Featuring, again, 5 tracks that are on here, but track 1 and 5 bookend the album the same way that Shine On You Crazy Diamond did for Wish You Were Here. This one here has Pigs on the Wing, and it is split bookending the album. Now, what I talked about with, the difference in how an album feels when it's on LP and it's 2-sided and you're flipping things over versus a CD, or in this case, on the 8-track version, because those are tape loops and simply restart, they didn't want part 1 and part 5 to back up against each other in the wrong way. So what they chose to do is actually join the 2 together and put a guitar solo in the middle that was incidentally played by Snowy White, not David Gilmour, because he had already left the studio. So really, there's only 4 songs on this album here. The meat and potatoes of this album, though, are the 3 middle songs that are on here. Dogs, which clocks in at 17 minutes. Pigs, 3 different ones, which clocks in at 11 minutes. And Sheep, which clocks in at 10 minutes. So for me, at least, these 3 tracks, these very long-form tracks, where I can sink my teeth into it. It also means that the songs don't get overplayed on the radio, something that I very much like, and probably one of the reasons that this album is a favorite of mine. But like Dark Side of the Moon, which was the first early album I picked up, this one here was one of the first ones that I picked up that I made sort of, again, my own choice. I had heard way so much going on about Dark Side of the Moon that I picked it up simply based on what I was hearing. And when I got that, I have to say I was a little let down by it because I didn't think it was as great as everyone said it was. Whereas I went out and picked this one up based on its album cover and just wanting to explore something new myself. Incidentally, I only spent 10 cents when I picked this up on LP back in the very early 90s, back when LPs were not what they are today. And this one here immediately connected with me and became something that stood out for me, and I have loved it ever since. This one here, regardless of those different reasons that I've given you, no filler, long songs that I could sink my teeth into, not overplayed on the radio, all that sort of stuff. It is a fantastic album. The long format songs have so much interest, in the change up and what's going on within them, that I don't lose my interest throughout on them. I never seem to tire of this album, which for me is why this is coming in at number 1. So there you go, all 15 of Pink Floyd's studio albums ranked for you guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Certainly let me know your thoughts. I'm sure your number 1 album will be something different than mine on here, but I hope you still enjoyed this all the same. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.